The most dangerous lie in personal finance is not that compound interest is fake. It is that compound interest is enough. People are shown a chart, a smooth little curve rising toward the sky, and the message feels almost moral in its simplicity. Start early. Stay consistent. Let the market work. Do not touch the money. Trust the magic. By the time you are older, wealth will have quietly built itself in the background while you were busy living your life. That story is not exactly false. It is worse than false. It is incomplete in a way that causes people to misdiagnose almost every problem they have in the first decade of building wealth, because the first decade is usually not a compounding story. It is a contribution story. That is the line I want you to keep with you all the way through this piece. Compound interest is not the strategy in the early years. It is the reward that arrives after the hard part. That is the mother line for everything I am going to say. Most people hear compound interest and imagine that the market begins doing serious work for them the moment they open an account. They imagine the machine starts humming on day one, maybe slowly, maybe modestly, but still in a way that should feel like a real force in their life. Then they put in $50 a month or $100 or even $200. And after a year or two or three, they look down at the numbers and feel something between disappointment and betrayal. Why does this still feel small? Why does the chart look so glorious, but my account still looks so ordinary? Why does everyone keep talking about compounding as if I should already feel it working when all I seem to feel is the fact that I am the one doing all the work? That gap is not in your imagination. The source you gave me puts its finger right on the wound. Compound interest is real. It works. It is not a scam, but it has a size problem below a certain balance and below a certain monthly contribution level. Compounding is technically happening, but functionally invisible. That is the key phrase, not mathematically absent. Functionally invisible, Fay file a site. Fay turn 58, file 0 Fay. That distinction matters more than almost anyone says out loud, because humans do not live inside pure mathematical truth. They live inside felt reality. And if a system is working, in theory, but not in a way that changes your life, your behavior, your confidence, or your options for 10 or 15 years, then for many people, it may as well not be working at all. Not because the math is wrong, because the psychology cannot survive on the math alone. That is why I think the first thing we need to do is separate two different meanings of the word works. There is works on a spreadsheet, and there is works in a way a human being can actually feel. Those are not the same standard. A $50 contribution earning 8% for 1 year may technically produce growth. But if that growth is $4, then let us be honest with each other. No life was changed by that $4. No one looked at that account and felt more secure. No one suddenly had better options. No one slept better. No one experienced wealth. The machine moved. The human did not. That is why the first rule is simple. Compounding does not begin to matter in your life when it becomes mathematically true. It begins to matter when it becomes psychologically visible. That is a much better standard. It explains why so many decent, disciplined people quit before the machine ever has a chance to reward them. They are told to start small and be consistent, which is directionally good advice. But the emotional truth hiding underneath it is far harsher than the slogan suggests. If you start too small, the first 10 years can feel pointless. The source says this clearly. There is a contribution threshold below which the early phase is so quiet that most normal humans cannot see enough evidence to stay motivated. They assume compounding is overhyped. They assume they are doing something wrong. They assume they need riskier assets. Or they simply give up. Fay file a site, Fay turn 58, file 0 Fay. That is not a character failure. That is a design failure in how the lesson is taught. Now let us look at the numbers, because the numbers are what strip away fantasy. The source walks through them using an 8% annual return assumption, which is conservative enough to keep the examples grounded and clean enough to make the contrast visible. $50 per M month, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the final number after 3 decades, roughly $74,000, is real money. But it is not retirement freedom. It is not the kind of outcome social media implies when it tells a young person that tiny contributions plus enough patience will someday feel like victory. The source is right to call this out. The machine works, but the output is too small, for too long, to feel like it matches the mythology surrounding it. Fay file a site, Fay turn 58, file 0 Fay. Then the source moves to $200 a month and then $400 a month. Same time horizon, same rate, vastly different ending balances. That is where the real lesson begins. The interest rate stayed the same. Time stayed the same. The world did not become kinder. The market did not become more generous. The only thing that changed was the amount going in every month, yet the outcome moved from modest to meaningful. That is not a side note. That is the central truth. In the early years, the input dominates the outcome. The percentage return is not the hero. The monthly contribution is Fay file site Fay turn 58 file 0 Fay. This is where I want to be very clear. When your pile is small, the rate matters less than people think. Size dominates. That is what wealthy people understand in their bones, even when they do not say it elegantly. A person with $5,000 at 7% is making $350 a year. A person with $500,000 at 7% is making $35,000 a year. Same intelligence, irrelevant, same market. Yes, same rate. Yes, different result entirely, because the machine only becomes noticeable when the pile becomes large enough for the percentage to produce an outcome with real weight. The source puts this, well, wealthy people look as if money is growing effortlessly for them, not because they discovered mystical return streams, but because they are compounding on a base large enough that the percentages finally have enough material to work on. Fay Felicite Fay turn 58 file 0 Fay I call this the pile problem. The pile problem is the fact that compounding at a small scale is mathematically valid but behaviorally weak, while compounding at a large scale becomes both visible and life, changing even at ordinary rates. That is the thing almost nobody teaches correctly. They teach the rate. They should teach the pile, because until the pile is large enough, almost everything interesting in the growth path is coming from the person, not from the market. That is the second rule. In the early years of building wealth, you are the engine, the portfolio is still mostly the passenger. That sentence should change how you think about almost everything. It should change how you think about salary growth. It should change how you think about side income. It should change how you think about spending discipline. It should change how you think about what is actually worth optimizing. The source hammers this point in the exact place most beginners get tricked. They look at their tiny gains and conclude the problem must be the rate. If only they could make 15% instead of 8%, everything would feel different. So they drift toward riskier assets, crypto, speculative growth names, leveraged promises, secret strategies. The source runs the comparison, and it is devastatingly useful. A jump from 8 to 16% on a modest monthly contribution over a decade helps, yes, but not nearly as much as people emotionally imagine. Increase the monthly contribution instead. And the result is often stronger with less risk. That is the whole lesson. At small balances contribution, growth beats return chasing far more often than the financial imagination of beginners wants to admit. Fay Felicite Fay turn 58 file 0 Fay. This is the third rule. When the pile is small, contribution growth usually matters more than return optimization. That is not an argument against good investing. It is an argument against premature obsession. A person with $2,000 invested does not need a genius portfolio. He needs a bigger funnel. That is where the actual leverage is. I call this the input advantage. The input advantage is the overwhelming effect of increasing monthly contributions when account balances are still small, relative to the much weaker effect of chasing marginally better returns at higher risk. This is why I think a lot of early investing content confuses cause and reward. People look at wealthy investors and see the reward phase, large balances, meaningful annual returns, portfolio growth that seems to accelerate by itself. Then they imitate the visible surface, asset selection strategies, return talk, while ignoring the invisible decade that built the pile. Nobody posts the years where the account felt boring. The salary growth mattered more than the market. The contribution was everything. And the returns were basically decorative. Those are the years that actually make the whole machine possible. The source says this directly too. Social media shows you the results. It does not show you the invisible phase. Fay Felicite Fay turn 58 file 0 Fay. That invisible phase deserves a proper name. I call it the contribution desert. The contribution desert is the long, early stretch of wealth, building where the investor sees little visible evidence of compounding, because the balance is still too small, even though the future engine is quietly being assembled under the surface. That desert is where most people lose the war, not because they chose terrible investments, because they expected the wrong kind of encouragement too early. They wanted proof the machine was alive. The machine was alive, it was just too small to roar. This is why I think the source S threshold idea is so useful. It does not claim there is some sacred mathematical law with a precise engraved number. It says something more useful. Based on realistic rates and lived experience, Compounding begins to feel real somewhere around $100,000 to $150,000 in total invested assets. At $100,000, an 8% return is roughly $8,000 a year, about $667 a month. At that point, the portfolio is no longer whispering. It is participating. It is making enough that a human being can feel the relationship between the balance and the outcome. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 58 File 0 Fay. That is the threshold, not where compounding becomes true, where it becomes visible, where the investor can finally say, now I understand what everyone was talking about. The source then does something I wish more people would do. It asks not, how do I maximize return? But how do I cross the threshold faster? That is exactly the right question, because once you realize the first phase is contribution, dominated, the path forward becomes much clearer. Stop fantasizing about miracle returns. Stop trying to outsmart the market with a tiny account. Stop confusing excitement for leverage. The fastest way to reach phase 2 is to raise the amount going in that can come from spending cuts, yes, but more importantly from income growth, additional work, side income, selling dead weight, redirecting raises, and treating contributions as non-optional. The source says this plainly too. Contribution growth is the strategy. Compounding is what happens after the strategy has done its job. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 58 File 0 Fay. That is the fourth rule. Compound interest is not the strategy. It is the reward for having executed the real strategy long enough. That is a much harsher framing than most people are given. It is also a much more empowering one, because if the strategy is contribution growth, then the early game becomes less mysterious. You are not waiting passively for magic. You are building the pile. You are raising the monthly amount. You are widening the funnel. You are shortening the distance to the threshold. Suddenly the whole thing becomes more active, more understandable, and more realistic. Now let me walk through the phase distinction in a way the source implies, but that deserves to be sharpened. Phase 1 is the grind. You contribute most of the growth yourself. You are the primary mover. The portfolio is helping, but not enough to change your life. Phase 2 is the flip. Returns begin to rival or exceed the monthly contributions. The machine is no longer being dragged forward, mostly by you. It is beginning to move under its own compounding momentum. The source gives a very useful example of the contribution versus return split. At small balances, most of the account growth in a month is still coming from your deposit, not from market gains. At $50,000, the split starts narrowing. At $100,000, the return contribution is starting to dominate much more meaningfully. At $200,000, the machine is doing several times more work than the investor as monthly input. That is the flip. That is what people are really waiting for. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 58 File 0 Fay call this the labor inversion. The labor inversion is the moment in wealth, building when the portfolio's own returns begin contributing more to growth than the investor's fresh monthly contributions. This is what people mean when they talk about money working for you. But I dislike that phrase when it is used too early. At $5,000 invested, the money is not really working for you in any meaningful life-changing sense. You are working for the money. Good. That is phase 1. Respect it for what it is. Do not demand phase. 2 magic from a phase. 1 account. That demand only breeds frustration. The 5th rule is this. Most early investors quit because they mistake phase 1 for failure, instead of seeing it as the necessary grind before the machine flips. That is where the emotional maturity comes in. Not patience in the abstract, patience tied to understanding. The source is good on this point because it refuses to romanticize the invisible years. It says outright that humans are not wired to keep doing things that feel pointless for a decade straight. Exactly. So the solution is not just be more disciplined. The solution is to understand why the early years feel that way and what metric actually deserves your attention. The metric is not how much did the market make me this month. The metric is how aggressively am I moving toward the threshold. That is a much better way to measure progress. And this is where I want to speak directly to the person who feels late, the one putting in $50 or $100 or $200, the one who has been doing the right thing but still looks at the account and sees nothing that feels transformative, the one who is tempted to conclude that compounding is a myth for ordinary people. The math is not lying to you, but it is not comforting you either. The account may still be too small for the rate to feel like a force. That is not proof of failure. That is proof that you are still in the part of the process where your life, your labor, your salary, your side income, your discipline, your ability to raise the monthly contribution, these are still more powerful than the portfolio itself. That is not a disappointment. That is just phase one, and phase one can still be won. Now let me make the most practical point in the entire source, even more blunt. Treat the investment contribution like a bill, not like leftovers. This is one of those boring truths that changes everything. Leftovers are a fantasy category. Most people spend up to their income. That is not evil. It is ordinary human behavior. If you tell yourself you will invest whatever remains at the end of the month, what remains is usually embarrassment. The source says the answer clearly: move the money before you see it. Automate the transfer, pay your future self first. Let the rest of your spending life adapt around what remains. Fay file a site, Fay turn 58 file 0 Fay. That is not motivational language. That is architecture. I call this the forced priority. The forced priority is the act of making investment contributions automatic and non-negotiable, so that wealth building happens before discretionary spending absorbs the month. This is how people really reach phase two, not by wishing harder, by structuring the month so the contributions happen even when the person is tired, busy, emotional, or tempted. And then there is one final insight in the source that I think deserves to be elevated above almost everything else. Take half of every raise and route it to investing. This is one of the cleanest bridges from phase one to phase two that exists. It lets lifestyle improve and contribution size improve at the same time. It prevents the whole raise from being eaten by life. It keeps the monthly amount moving upward, which is what phase one is really about, not perfection, upward input momentum. Fay file site, Fay turn 58 file 0 Fay that matters because people often think they need a dramatic reinvention to accelerate wealth. Sometimes they do, often they just need a better capture system for growth that is already happening. That is the sixth rule. Contribution growth is not only about cutting harder, it is about capturing more of your own progress before lifestyle absorbs it. Now let me pull the whole architecture together. If your monthly contribution is very small, the early years will feel almost insultingly quiet. That is normal. If your balance is small, return chasing is a distraction. Input growth matters more. If you want compounding to feel real, you must cross the threshold where the balance is finally large enough for the percentage return to produce a meaningful output. That threshold is not magic, but it often begins around the $100,000 range and becomes increasingly obvious as you move through it. Phase one is contribution, dominated. Phase two is return, dominated. The bridge from one to the other is not clever asset selection. It is a bigger pile built through disciplined, recurring, rising contributions. That is the whole story. And once you see it, almost all beginner confusion around compounding disappears. Now let me tell you the identity shift hidden inside this entire discussion. Most people are being trained to think like return seekers. I want you to think like pile builders. A return seeker looks at the account and asks, how do I get a higher percentage? A pile builder asks, how do I get to the threshold balance faster? A return seeker gets bored and starts chasing because the account feels small. A pile builder understands that small balances make percentages weak and therefore focuses on input. A return seeker wants the market to rescue him. A pile builder knows he is the engine until the pile is finally large enough to flip the relationship. That is a much better way to live through the early years. Not because it is more exciting, because it is truer. And true frameworks keep people in the game long enough for the math to actually reveal itself. If I were compressing the entire lesson of this source into one final sentence, it would be this. Compound interest is not useless if you invest small amounts. It is just too quiet for too long, unless you build the pile aggressively enough for the machine to finally become audible. That is the job. Not to worship the chart, to survive the invisible phase long enough and contribute hard enough that one day the chart starts becoming your life. And when that day comes, it will look like magic to everyone watching from outside. It will not be magic. It will be the delayed reward for understanding phase one better than they did.